we have a special Father's Day gift for all of us. And that is, in this hour, we are delighted to welcome back to the program Helen Thomas, veteran White House correspondent. She has covered every president since John F. Kennedy. And her books, Dateline White House, Front Row at the White House, and Thanks for the Memories, Mr. President, are marvelous compendiums of the history of our country over the last half century. And her new book came out last year, Watchdogs of Democracy, also outstanding. And I'm delighted to welcome Helen to the program. Helen, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thank you. I don't know if I'm very appropriate for Dad's Day.
Well, let me tell you, you are the mother of all White House correspondents, so that's good enough for me. Now,
thank you for the nice compliments and the good plugs for the books.
Well, they're all great, and as you know, my inscribed copies sit wonderfully on my shelf, and I love them.
Thank you. Let
me tell you, first of all, I've announced that you're going to be here. The board is already loaded with people who have questions for you, but I want to ask you the first question. You've been in the White House since the days of John F. Kennedy. You've had the ability to observe all of these American presidents. Will you reflect for me on how you classify, how you define the current administration, the Bush administration?
Terrible. Terrible. Hello?
Yep, I'm listening, and the one-word description bowls me over.
In all aspects. I mean, we are no longer what we were, which we had a halo. We've lost all of our moral compass. We've lost everything. With a war of choice that was unnecessary. It's absolutely destroyed our reputation, our self-esteem, and our esteem in the world.
Now, I talked earlier, Helen, about the situation with the Justice Department, and I drew the analogy with the Nixon years. When you sit in the White House and you listen to the press briefings that are given and you see the president, can you describe how are people reacting to what's going on now with Alberto Gonzalez, with the whole question of the court ruling now that the president cannot exercise the privilege of holding people without trial, that we have the situation with an executive order sealing the papers of former presidents and vice presidents? How do you react to all of that?
Well, I think the reporters who have to do the straight reporting, I read an opinion column, I shake my head, but they have to, stay on the line, and they are getting tougher. They were so weak and just out of it, in a coma during the run-up to the war. But now I think they are beginning to see the light and know that this administration has to be questioned. And, the credibility is not there.
Now, we have many people who have questions. I want to jump right into it, if I may. Okay. Alan, calling from Castro Valley. Alan, welcome to KGO.
It's an honor to speak to you. You are the benchmark, and you should always be in the front row.
You're too kind.
But when you ask a pertinent question and the president avoids answering it or confronting it, do any other reporters in the White House press room do a follow-up, ask the questions that you ask, or do they avoid the tough questions? Or are there nobody but you?
No, it isn't that. The point is the president won't take any more questions from me, so I sort of, I'm on the sidelines. But I think the reporters, the problem is each one comes in to the press conference armed with their own question, and they don't listen to follow up. And the president won't take a follow-up from the original questioner. So it's left hanging in the air, no matter what he says, especially when he's dodging, because nobody calls his hand.
Was it easier in the old days when you wanted a follow-up question?
Of course. We would press on, and as uncomfortable as the president would seem, we definitely felt that he should not be let off the hook.
Is the press corps intimidated by the president?
I think some are. I'm not, but I think many are. And the whole question is, do their corporate heads want them to pursue and persist? And I think there's been a really weakening of that era. When I started working for UPI, we were straight reporters, factual and so forth, and we were backed up by our bosses.
Now, the book that you have most recently written, Watchdogs of Democracy, the waning Washington press corps and how it has failed the public, is available, everybody should know, from the KGO book line, 1-800-801-BOOK. It is a superb book. It isn't just a reminiscence. It is a real critique of the failure of the press. When we come back, Helen, many more people with questions, including me, my guest, the remarkable Helen Thomas, who has covered the White House from the days of John F. Kennedy forward and is truly one of the great icons of American journalism, a living legend, if you will, right here on KGO, where our time now is 5:13. Thanks, Helen. This is John Rothmann. My guest is Helen Thomas. You know her as one of the great journalists of all time, but more important, she's still there. She's still speaking. She is still trying to ask those questions and writing her column for the Hearst Syndicate. For 57 years, she represented UPI in the White House. Helen, let me ask you a question about your own relations. The president stopped taking questions from you. Why?
Well, I think he can't take my questions because I believe in the shortest distance between 2 points is a straight line, and I think they consider it too tough. And it's easy to avoid because this president actually comes into the press conference with a list of names of the reporters he's to call on. And that doesn't mean they're soft touches, but they're more acceptable.
Boy, unbelievable. Even Richard Nixon didn't pull that, did he?
No. In the direst moments of Watergate scandal where we were really pressing in, he took the questions, I must say. He didn't like them, and one day he stalked out of the press conference. But nevertheless, he stood there.
Let's go to Doug, calling from Santa Cruz. Doug, welcome to KGO.
Hi, John, and good morning, Helen. It's a privilege to speak with you.
Thank you.
On this 35th anniversary of the Watergate break-in, I think it's important to remember that unwarranted wiretapping of American citizens was forcefully opposed in the early 70s. Recently, the President and Andrew Card and Alberto Gonzales proposed unwarranted wiretapping of American citizens. Do you think that proposal will lead to a Watergate-style investigation and possible impeachment? And if not, why not today?
Excellent.
You have a very chicken Democrats who are only looking for 2008 and finding out they've missed the boat. They don't understand the outrage of the American people, and they want to play it safe. So I don't think any of those things are going to happen. The Democrats are very different than the Republicans on the really ultra-conservative side. They never gave President Clinton 1 second, and I didn't see a minute in the White House when he was not being investigated.
Let me ask you, if this were a Democrat in the White House and the Republicans were in opposition and the Democrat were doing what this president's doing, would the Republicans be outraged?
Not only outraged, but they'd be hanging him at dawn.
What's the difference? What's the problem with the Democrats?
Well, I don't think it's a problem. I think it's turning the other cheek and being much more tolerant of foibles and so forth. And more than that, I think they're not vindictive.
Now, Bob Byrd, Senator Robert Byrd, who you know well, has said that essentially Congress has rolled over and played dead. Is that true?
Absolutely, in every sense of the word. I mean, they don't really have the majority votes. It's true they can be outmanned and outmaneuvered and something, but they don't even make a try, and that's what they should do. They should uphold the banner of our values and honesty and our credibility.
Let's go to Michael calling from Kensington. Michael, welcome to KGO with Helen Thomas. You with me?
Yes.
All right, well, Michael isn't, so we're going to go to David calling from San Francisco. David, welcome to KGO.
Yeah, morning, John and Helen. Great to talk to you.
Thank you.
I told the screener I was interested in the Bush family history. Probably the easiest one-shot liner that I could come up with regarding this firing of the U.S. attorneys is when they claim that Clinton fired all 93 at once. All it would take for the Democrats or anybody with a brain would be just count all of the scandals that they were involved in that prosecutors were not highlighting. For example, the savings and loans looting, the Iran-Contra, a whole variety of other pollution and corporate crimes that were going on, and none of those U.S. attorneys back in the Bush and Reagan term did anything about these major crimes. So it would have been a given that to fire all of them would have been a real loyalist application of U.S. habits. But one of the things that I'm most concerned with is the Bush ties to the Nazis, and I'm looking at whether or not Bush is an incompetent or whether he's more of a saboteur.
Well, let's ask the question: Is President Bush incompetent, or does he know what he's doing?
I think he knows what he's doing. I mean, I think he has a lot of street smarts. I don't think he's in depth on our history and so forth. But he was warned by his father on the whole question of going on to Baghdad, and so forth. So he gets a lot of advice, but he doesn't want to hear any dissent. And that's the problem.
Helen, I want to ask you about the Vice President of the United States. You have watched Vice Presidents since Lyndon Johnson all the way up and down the line. Many people call Dick Cheney the most powerful Vice President we've ever had. How do you rate him, and what are your observations about his conduct in office?
I think he's extremely powerful, and I think he's definitely a militant, a hawk. And wars, he didn't fight any wars, and he didn't join up in Vietnam, and neither did the president. But they are very happy to send everybody else.
Can I ask you, there have been major stories out of Washington that there is a real battle going on between Condoleezza Rice and Dick Cheney over Iran, and whether negotiation or military action should be taken. Do you sense that tension from where you sit?
I know that she has been a part of the whole hawk element of this administration. I don't know if there's been a real split, but I think when you are in charge of diplomacy in this government and you see us losing a war, I think it would really see the folly of trying to go into another war. The Cheney people definitely want some sort of an attack on Iran. And I think she's stepping back from that, maybe using her good head for once.
My guest is Helen Thomas, who always uses her good head. It's not just once, it's every time she speaks. And again, her book, the most recent book, is Watchdogs of Democracy, ? Where is the press? They're absent. And it is available from the KGO book line, 1-800-801-BOOK. And if you want a real treat, go back and get her previous books, Dateline White House, Front Row at the White House, and Thanks for the Memories, Mr. President. All of the history that she has lived comes to bear in all that she does, and we are delighted to have her here on the program. I'm John Rothmann, and we'll be right back with your questions for Helen Thomas on KGO. My guest is Helen Thomas. Helen, one of our colleagues here at KGO wanted me to ask you about Stephen Colbert and whether you think he's got a political future.
I think he's doing fine. I didn't know he aspired to any political role, but I think it would be great whatever he does.
All right, you got the answer there. That was one of our engineers, who, by the way, is one of your biggest fans. So
great, bring him on.
All right, let's go to Richard calling from Richmond. Richard, welcome to KGO.
Good morning, John. Good morning, Helen.
Morning.
Now, press secretaries come and go, and I'm sure that each administration chooses one who agrees with them ideologically. Now, do you think that someone who has a background like Tony Snow endears himself to the press corps?
That's a great question. I knew Jim Haggerty very well. I think he was one of the great press secretaries of all time, and Pierre Salinger, of course, a native of San Francisco and a graduate of Lowell High School. Tell me about Tony Snow. What are your observations?
My observation is that he was one of us. He was a newspaper man, albeit very, very conservative. And he does a good job for the administration. But you also have to wear another hat, which is to be true to the American people, to try to keep them informed and walk the straight line on that. It's very hard. You have to be a schizophrenic, really, to serve two masters. And mainly he serves the president. Very smooth, very articulate, He's pretty well liked and so forth, but there's a lot of sympathy there, too.
Once upon a time, when I wanted information, I relied on you at the White House. Today, a lot of people rely on talk show hosts for their information.
God help us.
Well, that was my question. How do you see the impact of talk radio, and particularly the right-wing talk radio in this country?
Well, I think they've had a tremendous influence, but I think it's dwindling down. I think the American people are beginning to see the other side of the question, which is this war and so forth, which they pumped up, never asked any questions or anything. And I really resent the fact that people think they're journalists. They're not. They are promoters, self-promoters.
And there's a big difference. Now, let me ask you one other question. There are a lot of people with questions, but I want to throw this in. You represented UPI 57 years in the White House. You were a critical force in trying to convey news. Is there any journalist, and in your book, you write about journalists who had an impact. If you were identifying a journalist today in the media who you think has a major impact, who would it be?
Well, I don't want to name names, but I do think the people who serve the cable and then TV networks are probably the most influential. They are the most visual. You get a big ID when you're on television 2 times. Mm-hmm. So I think in terms of impact, they would be the ones.
What about print media? You had such an impact in terms of what you wrote and how you told stories. Why would you say the print media has diminished in terms of its impact?
Because the great tragedy is we've become a country of one newspaper towns, and they are gradually losing their advertisers who keep them alive and so forth. There's a real concern in the industry that newspapers are dying out very fast because shareholders on Wall Street don't really give a darn. I can toughen that up. About what happens to journalism.
I don't want you getting any trouble.
Unless they make 30% profit on a newspaper, which is almost unheard of.
I don't want to get in any trouble with the FCC.
We're going down the drain. That's right. I'll clean up my language.
Although I can tell you, you work for the Hearst Corporation now. They give you a pretty clear shot, don't they, in terms of what you want to write?
Yes, they're very, very kind, and they allow me to go for broke.
Which is precisely what Helen Thomas does. Thank God she's not broke, if you'll pardon a bad use of grammar. She is with us and active, and those of you who are familiar with her career in Washington, covering every president since John F. Kennedy, and doing a brilliant job of it. You may agree with her, you may disagree with her, but tenacious and tough, and asking such tough questions that this president doesn't even want to call on her. But we'll come back so you have an opportunity with her. We're delighted on this Father's Day to have Helen Thomas, who really is a watchdog of democracy.
I hope I don't upset all the fathers.
Believe me, you couldn't upset us. You have too much to tell. All right, so when we come back, we'll do it. And Helen Thomas here, 8080810 is the number. You can order her book, Watchdogs of Democracy, ? A great book about the media and whether it works, from the KGO book line, 1-800-801-BOOK. 5:35 here on KGO. Our guest is Helen Thomas, now a correspondent and writer for Hearst, but previously with UPI for 57 years, covering the White House since John F. Kennedy's administration. She's known every president, and every president has known her. 8080810 is the number. Let's get right back to the calls. Danny calling from Mill Valley. Danny, welcome to KGO with Helen Thomas.
Yeah, hi. Thank you, Helen Thomas, for your patriotism.
Thank you.
In a world with too much chauvinism.
Right.
But, my main point is that what's important to the factors of Iraq is the human cost and financial cost, which is not reported, I don't think, by the mainstream media. I mean, I think we have several different sources. There's over 100,000 U.S. casualties not reported. We have $59 trillion national debt. I know Americans don't know the difference between deficit and debt, but I think we can't accurately assess from whatever political side what's going on if this isn't reported. And why would you say, or why aren't those things covered by the mainstream media?
Great question. What's going on with the mainstream media, Helen?
I think they've really fallen down on the job. There is no question the news agencies should have protested all the censorship that was instituted at the start of this war, the cover-up, the, what shall I say? I mean, falsehoods. I don't like to say lies because you have to decide whether they were deliberate or not. I do think there was a definite intention to go to war and fixing the facts around the policy, as the Downing Street memo said.
Now, you make a big thing in your book about the Downing Street memo and the mainstream media not latching onto it. You felt it was a critical factor.
Absolutely.
Why?
When the chief of intelligence for Britain comes to Washington in July 2002, talks with people at the White House, CIA, Congress, every other defense, Pentagon, and comes back and writes this memo saying they're determined to go to war and they're going to fix the facts around the policy, which means you're going to twist the facts.
Helen, what I don't understand, and I was in Washington at a time when the media was unrelenting in its coverage, and you've touched on this a little bit, but I just don't get it. Where are they?
9/11, the fear card. Everyone was afraid to be called unpatriotic. Not everyone. Unpatriotic, un-American. And an atmosphere, the whole climate took over Washington, that you don't criticize anything, you're in a state of crisis. So I think that those shows that even in a democracy, people are afraid to question.
Is that still the case? Do you find that there is a sense of fear about raising questions?
I think there's a grand awakening. There was in the November election, and I think the American people are beginning to realize they've been had.
Let's go to Robert, calling from San Francisco. Robert, welcome to KGO.
Good morning to you both. I have two quick questions for Ms. Thomas. One, Dick Morris wrote a recent book called Outrage. He claims this is the most corrupt Congress since Warren Harding. That's my first question. I'd like to get your take on that. And number two, Robert Kennedy Jr. in his book, Crimes Against Nature, asked the question, what liberal media? I'd like to get your take on that.
What was what?
What liberal media?
Yeah,
there is no real liberal media.
First place, I think that Dick Morris ought to know. He's almost been defending many of the things that they do and so forth. So, I mean, he's more in the know than I am. And I totally agree with Robert Kennedy.
Now, very often when I listen to conservative radio, they say, well, it's the mainstream media or the drive-by media, as they call it, that's really in control. When you consider the power of the New York Times versus Rush Limbaugh, who has greater power in this country today?
Well, I'm afraid that Limbaugh, with 3 hours every afternoon pounding away, has probably, New York Times to me is a great Bible every day, but at the same time, who's reading it besides maybe the officials and press and so forth? But does the average American read the New York Times? Well, they do get when it's syndicated in the newspapers, but that's a soup song. That's very little. And
it's not the editorial opinion.
No.
Which is also, to me, very disturbing.
And a lot of the newspapers, of course, supported the war, even blindly.
8080810 is the number right here on KGO. We have to do another round of commercials. When we come back, many more of you with questions for Helen Thomas. She is not only a legend in the newspaper business, and her resume and her writing all together tell that story, but she is a remarkably keen observer, and I believe an accurate observer, of what is going on today in this country. When we come back, more with Helen Thomas right here on KGO. My guest is Helen Thomas. She is the Dean of the White House Press Corps, the recipient of more than 30 honorary degrees, honored in 1998 with the inaugural Helen Thomas Lifetime Achievement Award established by the White House Correspondents Association. Her previous books, all of which are just splendid, Dateline White House, Front Row at the White House, Thanks for the Memories, Mr. President, and her current book, Watchdogs of Democracy, ? Available from the KGO book line, 1-800-801-BOOK. Let's jump right back to it, Helen. So many people with questions. Michael calling from Kensington. Michael, welcome to KGO.
Well, I'm not Michael. I'm Paul. I'm in San Francisco.
Well, go ahead, Paul. You take it. Go ahead.
Thank you. Good morning. I was interested in the Scooter Libby case. I read now that the judge has apparently received death threats. And you were just talking about the major media, especially the Rush Limbaughs, and those fellows are out there actively looking for pardons for Mr. Scooter Libby. And at the same time, the judge, who was appointed by Reagan, was elevated by Bush, and has been put on the top secret court by Bush, this Bush, has received death threats from apparently the same people that want to get Scooter Libby a pardon. So that's a story that is not getting out there in the press, and I think that alone would pretty much, if Bush is at 18% or so, maybe that would solidify the last nickel and dime.
Well, let's get a comment on it. What do you think of the Scooter Libby case, Helen?
Well, I think it's sad, and I think that obviously he was not operating alone. He was not a freelancer. He's a part of the whole cabal in the White House who were out to get Joe Wilson and his wife. And I think that he is paying the price for a lot of others who were involved.
Is he taking the fall for the White House?
Oh, I think so, but I don't think he's... I mean, he has... it isn't just the, way out people who are extremists who are supporting him. A lot of the judges, lawyers, law professors and so forth have written in to the president to give a pardon.
Why?
Well, I don't know why, really, but they do think that he is a man who they believe, I guess, he's been shortchanged.
Do you think that the judge, and you're there and you're watching this, remembered Judge Sirica sentencing Jim McCord and
right,
threatening a harsh sentence if McCord didn't come forward? Was it this judge's intention to force Scooter Libby to tell the truth?
I honestly don't know what was in his mind. All I know is he's standing tough.
Now,
hanging tough.
That's for sure. It's fascinating to me. Let me ask you quickly about executive privilege. There's some talk that the president not only might pardon Scooter Libby, but might extend executive privilege to Harriet Miers and others in the White House who have been subpoenaed. Do you think that if that were to happen and it were to go to the United States Supreme Court, that the court would uphold a president's right, or do you think...
Absolutely. Have you looked at this court? We're in for many bad years with them in power because they definitely are so conservative. They certainly would stand by President Bush, who appointed them.
5-4 vote, do you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah, that's my sense of it, too. I tried to point out earlier that I remember in the case of the United States versus Richard Nixon, where it was an 8-0 decision, or in the case of Bill Clinton over the question of revealing the Secret Service logs, again, a 9-0 decision, that this court, in all likelihood, would stand with this president and broaden executive privilege.
I don't see any deviation. No, they know why they were picked.
Yep. All right, let's go to Sherm, calling from Pleasant Hill. Sherm, welcome to KGO.
Yeah, hi. Helen Thomas, I just can't believe I'm talking to you. You've been in my living room for so many years. You're like an old friend. Let me put it another way. You're like a long-time friend. Perhaps that's better.
Thank you.
I was concerned about Ray Taliaferro, who's a host on KGO during the weekdays. He brought up PNAC. And that really is distressing to see that years ago so many high-level people planned this whole thing out. And it looks like it's falling into place. And just how far can they go with that? What do you think about that?
You mean in terms of the war?
Yes, in terms of, PNAC, which we've talked about here. In fact, I talked about it in the year 2000 when George Bush was running for president, because it was a public document. But the question of whether or not a small group can really guide policy.
I know what you mean. Well, their dreams were being fulfilled up to the point that of Iraq, and this was their starting point. They were first going to take Iraq, Syria, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and on through Egypt. I think they've been cut off at the pass. I think more and more people are saying you can't win this war. Definitely may have created so much opposition. We have inflamed the whole Middle East. The president stuck his finger in the hornet's nest. There's no way the neocons, the hawks, can fulfill their ambitions.
My guest is Helen Thomas. As you can see, she is someone without any opinion at all. And that's what makes her so dull as a guest. No, she is marvelous and really an amazing individual. And if you've never read her books, you must read them. Dateline White House was her first book. Her second book, Front Row at the White House. Her third book, Thanks for the Memories, Mr. President. And now her latest book, a very important book, Watchdogs of Democracy, dealing with a question of the Washington Press Corps and how it has failed the public. I'm delighted to tell you that thanks to the Hearst Corporation, Helen Thomas is still in there battling, and we are grateful for it. When we come back, we'll take the last group of questions. It is 5:49. I am John Rothmann, right here on KGO. I'm John Rothmann. My guest is Helen Thomas. Some have called her the First Lady of White House Correspondence. She is certainly the Dean of White House Correspondence, a brilliant writer and author. Her latest book, Watchdogs of Democracy, ? Available from the KGO book line, 1-800-801-BOOK. Let's whip into some more calls here. Michael calling from Kensington. Michael, welcome to KGO.
Good morning, John.
Morning.
And good morning, Ms. Thomas. I just want to say that it's an honor to speak with you. I felt very insulted by the president when with the treatment that he gave you, moving you out of the front row and stopping the first question honor. I felt that it was an insult to the American people. And one question I have is, with a lack of follow-up questions, why do journalists in the Washington Press Corps ask a serious question and then combine it with an inane question, giving the president an opportunity to answer only the inane question and ignore the other question?
Great question. Helen?
I think it's really the wrong approach, and I think, you Monday morning quarterback these questions yourself, and I'm sure they regret that when they've got the answer to the inane question. But on the question, I didn't really deserve to be in the front row for news conferences, because those are really reserved for the wire services, and I was no longer with UPI. So I wasn't done in, but I did put my hand up, and I was in his face many times, and he wouldn't call on me. But that's okay. I mean, that's his privilege. The point is that the reporters should ask tough questions. They have one chance in the barrel to really try to tell the American people that they are informed and trying to keep them on the road to truth.
Do you think in the next administration, whoever the next president is, things will change?
They will change to a great degree. Nobody, no candidate can run in 2008 and support this war. That it's the war to nowhere, and I don't see how they could get elected. On the other hand, when they come into office, the Iron Curtain comes down at the White House. Secrecy prevails. All information becomes a presidential prerogative. So these are things that take over. I mean, and all I can say is every candidate should have his feet to the fire on this in this campaign.
I'm not going to ask you to critique the candidates, but do you think in 2008 we have a good crop of candidates, one who could emerge and be an effective president?
I am surprised that every Republican candidate is for this war, except maybe Hagel, who isn't yet an announced candidate if he's running at all. Mm-hmm. I think that the other side, they've got to show much more candor. They have to show many more values than I think we're all in a dilemma, frankly.
Is there a way out, Helen? If there were a candidate running who had a way out, what do you think the solution would be?
I think definitely we should have been out of Iraq yesterday. I remember when President Reagan pulled out of Lebanon. It was on a weekend, a Friday night, after all the news shows had closed down. He said they put out a piece of paper saying we are redeploying. By Monday, nobody really gave it I never questioned why or did any Monday morning quarterbacking anything. They were so relieved. And Vietnam, a sense of relief, even though we were clinging by fingertips to helicopters from rooftops to leave. Just get out. Get out and save lives all around.
Is there any chance that you can see from where you sit that the Washington establishment, the Senate, the House, the White House, will move toward that kind of disengagement in the near future?
I don't see it happening immediately, and it's going to be incremental, which I think is lousy. I just say pull out. That's all. People, Iraq has been invaded since 1254. They have had one invasion, one occupation after another. And somehow people find their own level, and they learn to govern themselves.
If you were going to give advice to someone starting out in journalism, working in Washington, perhaps one day seated at the White House, what would that advice be?
Seek the truth. Let the chips fall where they may. Have a lot of courage, and just stand strong.
All right, let me ask you a couple of quick questions, just for my own perspective. The president, in your judgment, in your observation, who was the most effective president?
I think in terms of inspiring the Americans, of telling them they could reach for the stars, really, that there's a universe out there that we had to explore. Give something back to public service, Kennedy. But Johnson, on the domestic side, in his first 2 years of the tailwind of the Kennedy assassination, was magnificent. He got rammed through Medicare, Civil Rights Act, voting rights for blacks for the first time in the South, federal aid to education at all levels from Head Start through college, child and maternal health, environmental laws, public housing, you name it. It was incredible.
I recently had George McGovern here on the program, and George observed to me that despite Vietnam, he ranked Lyndon Johnson as one of the 5 greatest presidents of this country ever had.
There's no question. Vietnam was his denouement, but he definitely, on the domestic side, was the best since FDR, the last half of the 20th century.
Well, let me tell you, Helen, I think I speak for everybody who is listening and the many callers who want to ask you questions. We're out of time. That you rank as, without a doubt, the preeminent White House journalist, and it is a privilege always to have you on this program. And I want to thank you, and I want to thank you not only for being with us this morning, but for the work you have done and continue to do to preserve the country we all love so much.
Thank you so much. I don't deserve the kind of crown you've given me, but I hope I can live up to it.
Well, it's a pleasure, and when you're here in town, we'd love to have you live in studio.
Thank you.
All right, Helen, have a great day, and thanks again.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, sorry we're out of time, and to all of you who had questions, I apologize. Stay tuned now for Bernie Ward. He'll be in with God Talk. And, of course, I want to wish all of you a very happy Father's Day. And to Francis Stark, thank you for a splendid morning. I'll be back for Ray Taliaferro Friday morning, right here on KGO, San Francisco, San Jose.